Imagine this. An elderly black woman, a retired teacher who spent decades shaping young minds, is quietly making her way through the streets of Atlanta in her wheelchair, just trying to buy groceries, only to be shoved by the very people sworn to protect and serve. Now imagine her daughter, a U.S. Marshal agent, watching it all unfold. Seconds later, the badge doesn't matter. The uniform doesn't matter. Justice comes swinging with a single punch. This is the story of Margaret Stone and her daughter, Aaliyah, a story about race, justice, and what happens when power is abused in plain daylight. Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just about one cop or even one family. It's about every mother, every daughter, and every fight for dignity. And if you believe in standing up against injustice, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. It was a warm spring afternoon in Atlanta. The sun bounced off the tall glass buildings downtown, and people hurried along Peachtree Street. Cars honked. Street vendors called out, and life moved with the usual rhythm of the city. Margaret Stone, age 68, rolled her wheelchair toward the corner market. She was a retired literature professor, sharp-eyed and graceful, even as time had slowed her steps. A car accident years earlier had left her in the chair, but hadn't stolen her independence. That afternoon, she wore a floral blouse, her silver hair pinned neatly, her reading glasses dangling from a chain around her neck. She clutched her tote bag, humming a hymn under her breath. "Excuse me, ma'am," a young man said, holding open the market door. Margaret smiled warmly. Atlanta had always been kind to her, at least most of it. Margaret exited the store with a bag of apples and bread on her lap. She wheeled herself carefully down the ramp, pausing at the busy crosswalk. That's when it happened. A patrol car screeched to a stop beside her. Two white officers stepped out. Their badges caught the sunlight. Their eyes caught Margaret. "Hey, you can't sit here," one barked. His voice was sharp, commanding. Margaret looked up, startled. "I'm just waiting for the light to change." The officer frowned. "Don't get smart with me." Before she could respond, he shoved the handles of her wheelchair hard. Margaret gasped as her chair lurched forward, spilling her grocery bag. Apples rolled across the pavement. She nearly toppled out, clutching the armrest to steady herself. Bystanders froze. A couple pulled out their phones. Someone shouted, "Hey, leave her alone!" But the officer wasn't finished. He loomed over her, his partner crossing his arms behind him like backup. Margaret's voice shook, but her dignity didn't. Why would you do that? I'm not hurting anyone." The officer sneered. "People like you are always blocking the sidewalk." Margaret thought the humiliation was over. It wasn't. Another patrol car pulled up, then another, within minutes. For officers stood around her wheelchair. The air thickened with authority, with power, with menace. One officer grabbed her tote bag, shaking it open as if searching for contraband. Bread fell to the ground, the loaf splitting open. Another officer kicked an apple with his boot, sending it rolling into the gutter. Margaret tried to steady her voice. "I'm a retired professor. You can check my ID. I haven't broken any law." But her words didn't matter. The more she spoke, the more their tempers flared. "Stand up," one ordered. "I can't," Margaret replied. "Then you're resisting." Another snapped. The crowd grew larger. Some shouted in protest. Others recorded, their phones capturing every second. Still, the officers pressed in, and then one pushed her chair again. This time, Margaret fell sideways onto the pavement. Gasps ripped through the crowd. Her palms scraped against the concrete. A silence followed. Heavy, charged. At that exact moment, Aaliyah Stone was a block away. Aaliyah, 34, had returned to Atlanta after years of service as a U.S. Marshal. Her hair was tied back, her stride strong. She carried the presence of someone who had seen too much, fought too hard, and knew exactly when to step in. She was supposed to meet her mother for lunch. She carried 2 sandwiches in a paper bag. When she turned the corner and saw the commotion, she stopped cold. Her mother, Margaret, was on the ground, surrounded by police. Something inside Aaliyah snapped. The sandwiches dropped. Her fists clenched. Her badge didn't matter. Her title didn't matter. At that moment, she was only one thing: a daughter. She stormed forward, her voice cutting like a blade. "Get your hands off my mother." The crowd parted as Aaliyah pushed through, phones tilted higher, capturing the moment. One officer laughed. "Who are you supposed to be?" Another step closer, his hand reaching toward Margaret as if to grab her arm. And that's when it happened. Aaliyah's fist connected with his jaw. A sharp crack echoed in the air. The officer stumbled backward, clutching his face in shock. The crowd erupted, shouts, gasps, cheers. Some chanted, "Justice, justice." The other officers spun around, hands on their weapons, their authority now challenged. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. Her voice rang out with steel. "I'm a U.S. Marshal, and if any one of you touches my mother again, you will answer to me." The scene froze in chaos. An officer on the ground, groaning. Margaret still lying on the pavement, tears streaking her face but eyes blazing with pride. Aaliyah standing tall, her fist still trembling from the punch. The other officers circled in, hands twitching over their holsters. The crowd pressed closer, chanting louder. And in that split second, the question hung heavy in the Atlanta air. Would Aaliyah be able to protect her mother from the system itself, or would the system crush them both? The street outside the small grocery store on Auburn Avenue had erupted into chaos. The street outside the small grocery store on Auburn Avenue had erupted into chaos. Knocked sideways, cracked on the concrete. Above her stood Officer Granger, the cop who had shoved her like she was trash to be discarded. His chest rose and fell with arrogance. His lips curled into a smirk that sent chills through the onlookers. Seconds earlier, he had thought his authority was absolute. But then, his smugness was shattered by the sight of Aaliyah Stone. Her fist had connected with his jaw so cleanly, so fiercely, that the sound echoed across the block. The officer stumbled back, his face contorted in shock and rage, as if he couldn't fathom that anyone, let alone a black woman, would dare strike him. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted, but only for a moment, because now other officers moved in. 3 more cops, uniforms pressed, guns at their sides, closed ranks around Aaliyah. Their hands hovered near their holsters, their eyes sharp with hostility. The tension thickened in the air, like static before a lightning strike. Margaret, struggling to lift herself, screamed hoarsely, "Don't you touch my daughter!" Her voice, though cracked with age, carried a strength that stunned the crowd gathering around. Dozens of witnesses had stopped what they were doing. People filming with their phones, others shouting protests, mothers shielding their children's eyes from violence. Aaliyah stood tall in the center, her stance wide, protective, her fists clenched like a fighter stepping into the ring. But this wasn't just any fight. This was her mother's dignity, her mother's safety, her family's very humanity hanging in the balance. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's Professor Stone. She taught my sister at Spelman." Another voice rose above the noise. "She's a retired teacher. What are y'all doing pushing her like that?" The murmurs grew into a roar. People recognized Margaret Stone, not just as any woman in a wheelchair, but as an educator who had spent decades shaping young black minds in Atlanta. To see her humiliated like this, it wasn't just cruel, it was personal. Phones were out everywhere. Every angle of the confrontation was being captured. Every push, every insult, every punch. It was all going live on social media, spreading across Atlanta like wildfire. The officers knew it. You could see the panic flash in their eyes. But authority makes men desperate. Officer Granger staggered back toward Aaliyah, wiping blood from his lip where she'd struck him. His pride was wounded, his authority challenged. And for men like him, that was worse than pain. "You're under arrest," he spat, pointing at Aaliyah. "Assaulting an officer. Put your hands behind your back." Aaliyah didn't move. Instead, she squared her shoulders, her badge glinting under the August sun. She pulled it from her pocket with a slow, deliberate motion and held it high for the crowd and the cops to see. The golden shield of the United States Marshal Service. The crowd gasped. Even the officers froze for a moment. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "My name is Aaliyah Stone. I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal. And you just shoved a retired professor, my mother, out of her wheelchair. If you think I'm letting that slide, think again." The officers faltered. For a split second, their certainty cracked. A U.S. Marshal was standing in front of them. Not just a civilian. Not just some angry daughter. But someone with federal authority. But authority can blind. Granger sneered, trying to mask his unease. "Marshal or not, you assaulted me. That's a crime." The other officers nodded, emboldened by his words, moving closer. Their hands brushed against their batons, some resting on their tasers. The crowd erupted with shouts of protest. She was defending her mama. "Y'all started this." We saw him push her. The air was thick with outrage. People were pressing closer, some filming just inches away, others screaming in the officers' faces. Atlanta's streets were no stranger to protest, but this was something raw, something immediate. The people weren't just angry at injustice in the abstract. They were watching it unfold in real time, right before their eyes. And they weren't going to stay silent. On the ground, Margaret tried to push herself up. A woman from the crowd rushed to her aid, gently lifting her glasses and setting them back on her face. Tears streamed down Margaret's cheeks, not from weakness, but from fury. She clutched the woman's hand, whispering, "Don't let them take my baby." When she looked up at her daughter, something changed. For a moment, she wasn't just Margaret Stone, the professor, the mother, the elder. She was the embodiment of every black woman who had been silenced, overlooked, dismissed. Her pain became fuel. Her voice became fire. And the crowd fed on that fire. "Hands off the stones," someone chanted. It caught on. Soon dozens of voices echoed the same words. "Hands off the stones. Hands off the stones." The chant thundered down the street. The cops looked rattled. This wasn't just a scuffle anymore. It was a standoff. One officer muttered into his radio, calling for backup. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder with every second. Aaliyah saw it all playing out. The tightening circle of cops, the approaching sirens, the restless crowd that could boil over at any second. She knew this wasn't just about her mother anymore. This was about the whole city, the whole country. Her voice rang out, commanding and sharp. "The world is watching you right now. Every camera here is live. Every word you say, every move you make, it's all being recorded. Think very carefully about what you do next." The officers hesitated, glancing around at the sea of phones pointed their way. Their power, once absolute, was crumbling under the spotlight. But then, Granger lunged. He went straight for Aaliyah, his hand snapping out to grab her wrist. And that's when everything exploded. The crowd surged forward. People screamed. The officers shoved back. A bottle flew through the air, shattering on the pavement. The chant of "hands off the stones" turned into a roar of chaos. Margaret, still on the ground, cried out as people stumbled dangerously close to her wheelchair. Aaliyah caught Granger's arm mid-grab, twisting it with the precision of her martial training. He howled in pain as she flipped him over her hip and slammed him against the hood of a squad car. The crowd went wild. The police station had never felt so tense. Hours had crawled by since the confrontation in front of Margaret Stone's apartment complex, the one that ended with a decorated U.S. Marshal decking a uniformed officer in defense of her disabled mother. But Atlanta wasn't about to let this story fade quietly into the night. Inside the station, fluorescent lights hummed. Officers shifted nervously. Phones rang off the hook. The video of the incident had already spread online like wildfire. Dozens of cell phones had captured it. Within minutes, clips appeared on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Cop shoves elderly black woman out of her wheelchair. U.S. Marshal daughter floors him. Atlanta PD caught in scandal. By the time Aaliyah and Margaret were escorted inside for questioning, the city was already buzzing. Protesters gathered outside, chanting, holding up signs. Justice for Margaret. Protect black women. Margaret sat in a corner of the precinct lobby, her wheelchair steady now, her hands folded in her lap. The bruise forming on her wrist told the story the officer's report would try to erase. "Baby," she said softly, turning her eyes toward Aaliyah. "Don't let them break you. You did what you had to do. You stood up for me." Aaliyah, still catching her breath from the adrenaline, crouched down so her eyes were level with her mother's. Her U.S. Marshal badge felt like both a shield and a target on her chest. "I'd do it again, Mama," she said firmly, "every single time." Her mother's lips pressed into a faint smile, the kind only a retired teacher could give. Margaret Stone, who had spent decades teaching history in Atlanta classrooms, knew too well the cycles of injustice. And now, once again, she was living in one. But upstairs, things looked different. The officers huddled in a small meeting room, voices low but heated. "This is a disaster," one sergeant muttered. "That cop's face is all over social media. The department looks like a war zone out there. And the worst part," another officer cut in, slamming his palm on the table, "that woman isn't just anybody's mother. Her daughter is a damn federal agent, a U.S. Marshal." The room went quiet. Everyone knew what that meant. Jurisdiction, federal oversight, political firestorms. The kind of situation that could ruin careers. Still, the tension hardened into something uglier. The officer who'd been punched, his jaw now swollen, wasn't letting this go. "She hit me. I don't care who she is," he growled. "I want charges. Assaulting a police officer is a felony." One captain leaned back, sighing. "And what about what you did to the mother? You shoved an elderly disabled woman out of her chair. On camera." That silenced him for a moment, but his pride, his anger, wouldn't let him back down. "So what? They'll spin it. They always do. We say she resisted. We say it was an accident. Who's going to believe them over us?" The room exchanged glances. For years, this had been their shield, the blue wall of silence. But this time was different. Outside the precinct, the crowd had doubled. Community leaders and activists had arrived, megaphones in hand. Reporters were broadcasting live. One young activist shouted into the mic, "This is bigger than one cop. This is about respect for our mothers, our daughters, our sisters. How many more times do black women have to be assaulted, dismissed, and ignored before we say enough is enough?" The crowd roared. Margaret, watching from inside through the glass doors, felt her heart tighten. She had spent her career teaching her students about Dr. King, about Selma, about the civil rights marches in their own city of Atlanta. Now, decades later, she was at the center of another fight for dignity. Detective Harris finally called Aaliyah into a back office. He was older, weary, his face lined with years of cases that had blurred together. He gestured for her to sit. "Marshal Stone," he began, his voice measured. "You know why you're here." Aaliyah crossed her arms. "I defended my mother against an unlawful assault." The detective sighed. "You struck an officer. That's not something this department can just look the other way on." Her jaw tightened. "And your officer shoved my mother, an elderly disabled woman, out of her wheelchair. That's not something I can look the other way on." Their eyes locked. For a long moment, neither blinked. Finally, Harris leaned back, rubbing his temples. "You understand what's happening outside? Half the city is ready to burn this station down. And the other half? They're calling you a disgrace to the badge." Aaliyah's lips curled into a bitter smile. "I've been called worse." Hours stretched. Margaret insisted on speaking to the officers herself, demanding that her statement be taken on record. She described every detail: the shove, the fall, the pain, the humiliation. Her words carried the weight of a woman who had taught thousands of Atlanta's children to believe in truth, even when the system tried to bury it. Meanwhile, Aaliyah was left in limbo. Would she be charged? Would her career be destroyed in the name of protecting her mother? She tried to remain calm, but her mind kept flashing back to that moment. The look on her mother's face as she fell, the sound of her wheelchair hitting the pavement. Rage bubbled in her chest, but so did fear. As midnight neared, a higher-ranking official finally arrived, Deputy Chief Marlon Tate. His presence silenced the building. Tate was known for being shrewd, political, and ruthless when it came to protecting the department's image. He entered the room where Aaliyah sat, his sharp suit contrasting against the tired, wrinkled uniforms around him. "Marshal Stone," he began smoothly. "We have a problem, and I think you know it." Aaliyah didn't flinch. "The problem is your officer assaulted my mother." His eyes narrowed, cold but calculating. "No, the problem is optics. The problem is perception. And right now, perception says this department attacked a disabled black woman. That narrative cannot stand." Aaliyah leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "That's not a narrative. That's the truth." Deputy Chief Tate's lips curled into a thin smile. "Truth is what we write on paper. Truth is what makes it into the reports. And I'll tell you right now, you are one sentence away from being painted as the aggressor in all of this. Do you want that? Do you want your career, your badge, to be the casualty of tonight?" The threat hung in the air like a blade. Outside, the chants grew louder. Inside, tensions boiled. Aaliyah knew she was cornered. Speak out, and they'd smear her name. Stay silent, and her mother's suffering would be erased. Margaret rolled into the room then, her voice cutting through the tension like thunder. "You will not intimidate my daughter. Not tonight. Not ever." The room froze. Every eye turned to a retired teacher in her wheelchair, her frail body holding more strength than any badge could command. And then, just as Margaret finished her words, an officer burst into the room, out of breath. "Chief, sir, you need to see this. The governor's office is on the line, and they're asking about her." The camera pans on Aaliyah's face, her eyes narrowing. Whatever came next would change everything. Atlanta was on edge. The video of Aaliyah Stone decking the officer had gone viral overnight. News channels replayed the footage again and again. Margaret Stone tumbling out her wheelchair, her frail body striking the asphalt. The smirking officer reaching down, not to help but to mock, and then Aaliyah fierce, fast, and unflinching, striking back with the full force of justice. But what most of the public didn't see, at least not yet, was what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Inside that police station, chaos reigned. The officer she had punched, Officer Granger, had a swollen jaw and an ego bruise beyond repair. He stormed around the precinct like a man possessed, barking orders, his pride screaming louder than his pain. She assaulted an officer in broad daylight. Granger shouted, slamming his fist on the desk. I want her in cuffs. Tonight, other officers shifted uncomfortably. Some agreed, nodding quickly. Others exchanged glances, silently admitting what they all knew. Granger had crossed a line first. He had shoved a disabled woman, a retired teacher, respected in her community, out of her wheelchair. But in a world where blue walls protect blue uniforms, right and wrong often bent beneath the weight of loyalty. And Granger was counting on that. Meanwhile, Aaliyah sat at her mother's bedside. The ER doctor had confirmed that Margaret had a fractured wrist and bruised ribs, injuries that made Aaliyah's stomach twist with rage. But Margaret, even in pain, still managed a small, weary smile. You didn't have to do that for me, baby, she whispered, her voice raspy. Aaliyah leaned in closer. Yes, Mama, I did. You taught me never to let anyone trample on my dignity. Not when I was a child, not now, not ever. Margaret's eyes glistened. That's the teacher in me. But Aaliyah, these men, they don't play fair. You're not just up against one bad cop. You're up against the whole system. Aaliyah knew her mother was right, but she also knew something else. She wasn't about to let fear dictate her next move. Later that night, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, until curiosity got the better of her. When she answered, the voice was low, urgent. You don't know me, but I know you. What happened today, what that officer did to your mother, it's not the first time. Granger's been dirty for years. If you want proof, meet me tomorrow. Noon, Old Fourth Ward Park. Bring no one. The line went dead. Aaliyah froze, staring at the phone. Was this a trap? Or could it be the thread she needed to unravel the truth? Either way, she couldn't ignore it. But Granger wasn't wasting time either. Behind closed doors, he met with two fellow officers, men as ruthless as himself. She embarrassed me, he growled. And when people see that video, they'll think she's a hero. We can't let that happen. One of the other officers leaned back in his chair. So what's the play? Granger's lip curled into a sinister smirk. Simple. We flipped the story. She attacked me without reason. Her mother resisted police orders. We paint them as aggressors. By the time we're done, that video won't matter. The officers nodded, but Granger wasn't finished. And if she keeps pushing, if she comes digging into my past. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. Then she disappears. The next morning, Aaliyah walked into Old Fourth Ward Park. She scanned the area carefully, her U.S. Marshal instincts kicking in. On a bench near the lake sat a man in his late 40s, wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. You came, he said softly as she approached. Who are you? Aaliyah asked, her tone sharp. Doesn't matter. What matters is what I know. He slid a manila envelope across the bench toward her. Inside that folder is a record of every complaint ever filed against Granger. Excessive force, harassment, intimidation. Dozens of them, all buried, all ignored. Aaliyah's pulse quickened as she opened the folder. Each page was a damning piece of evidence, a tapestry of corruption stitched together by silence. Why give this to me? She asked, narrowing her eyes. The man looked away, his voice tight with regret. Because once, I was one of them. I kept my mouth shut while men like Granger destroyed lives. I can't change the past, but maybe I can help you change the future. Before Aaliyah could ask more, the man stood and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. She clutched the folder tightly. For the first time, she had a weapon, not just her fists, but the truth. But truth is dangerous when powerful men are desperate to bury it. That night, as she drove home, headlights appeared suddenly in her rear-view mirror. Bright, blinding, tailgating too close. Her gut tightened. She turned left. The car followed. She accelerated. The car matched her speed. Her training told her what her instincts already knew. Someone was hunting her, and she had a sinking feeling she knew exactly who. As Aaliyah sped through the streets of Atlanta, one thought consumed her mind. The fight wasn't just about protecting her mother anymore. It was about survival, and the truth she held in her hands was a truth worth killing for. The wooden doors of the Fulton County Superior Court creaked open that Monday morning. The gallery filled quickly. Neighbors, activists, church members, reporters, even a few students who once sat in Professor Margaret Stone's classroom. Everyone seemed to hold their breath at once. For nearly a year, the case had captured headlines. Now it would finally end. Margaret Stone sat in her wheelchair at the front row of the gallery, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a soft lavender scarf wrapped around her shoulders. She had aged since the incident, but her eyes carried the same quiet authority she once used to command lecture halls. Beside her, Aaliyah Stone sat in a tailored navy suit. Her posture was upright, her jaw tight, her presence radiating both discipline and defiance. No one would guess from her controlled demeanor that she was a woman who had punched a cop square in the face in defense of her mother. And at the center of it all sat Officer Thomas Granger, his once proud uniform now replaced with civilian suit, his hair grayer, his eyes darting nervously across the courtroom. The swagger he carried on the street was gone, replaced by the nervous shifting of a man who knew the world was watching. The judge entered. The gavel struck. The trial began. The prosecutor rose first. He was sharp, deliberate, every word chosen like a blade meant to cut through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady, "this case is about power, the abuse of power. An officer of the law, sworn to protect and serve, chose instead to brutalize a 68-year-old retired professor confined to a wheelchair. And when her daughter defended her, he and his fellow officers escalated instead of de-escalating." He paced before the jury box. "This case is not about one punch. It is about the push that came first, the shove that sent Margaret Stone, someone's mother, someone's teacher, someone's grandmother, toppling from her wheelchair onto cold concrete. That's the crime. That's the betrayal." Whispers rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor then turned to the jury, holding up still images from body cam footage. Frame by frame, it showed Granger's arm extended, Margaret's chair tipping, her body hitting the ground. The room grew silent. The only sound was Margaret's soft cough. "This isn't policing," the prosecutor said, voice breaking just slightly. "This is cruelty." Granger's attorney countered. He painted a picture of chaos, claiming the officer was just trying to maintain order. But the body cam footage didn't lie. Neither did the testimonies. Witness after witness took the stand. Bystanders, shop owners, even fellow officers who, under oath, admitted they were uncomfortable with how Granger handled the situation. The defense tried to spin it as an accident. But every time the footage replayed, the jury saw the same thing. A man in uniform pushing a woman who couldn't defend herself. By day 3, the defense was cornered. Their client wasn't just losing a case. He was losing his reputation, his shield, his story. The courtroom hushed when Margaret wheeled herself to the stand. Her voice was soft but unwavering, like a professor delivering her final lecture. "I spent 35 years teaching American history," she began, her eyes sweeping across the jury. "I taught young people about the Constitution, about freedom, about justice. But on that day, outside that store, I didn't feel like a citizen of this country. I felt like a problem to be shoved aside." Her words landed heavy. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "When I hit the ground," Margaret continued, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her scarf, I thought about all the elders who came before me, who marched and bled so we could be treated with dignity. And I thought, is this really what it's come to? Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice didn't falter. I don't want pity. I want accountability. Because if they can do this to me, in broad daylight, in front of my daughter, they can do it to anyone. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even the judge paused, letting the weight of her testimony linger. When Aaliyah Stone took the stand, the room leaned forward. She didn't dress like a victim. She dressed like the law enforcement officer she was. A U.S. Marshal who had chased fugitives across state lines. "Tell us why you struck Officer Granger," the prosecutor asked. Aaliyah sat taller. "Because he pushed my mother out of her wheelchair." Her words were crisp, sharp, undeniable. I didn't see a badge. I saw a man hurting the most important woman in my life. And I reacted. If defending my mother makes me guilty, then I accept that. But I will never apologize for standing between her and harm. A hush fell. For a moment, even the defense attorney lowered his eyes. The trial stretched over 2 weeks. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Some carried signs, "Justice for Margaret," "Dignity for all." Others wore T-shirts with Margaret's old faculty photo. Her warm smile printed beneath the words "Professor Stone taught us right." The courtroom became more than a legal battle. It became a symbol. Reporters framed it as mother versus. The badge. Commentators debated whether Granger's actions reflected a larger sickness in the system. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt like her voice mattered. The prosecutor's closing was simple. Officer Granger thought a uniform gave him a right to shove an elderly woman from her wheelchair. But justice isn't about uniforms. It's about accountability. Send a message, not just to him, but to every officer who thinks they can abuse their power and walk away. Tell them, not in this city, not in this courtroom, not on your watch. The defense tried one last plea. They spoke of split-second decisions and unintended consequences. But the room had already shifted. The jury's eyes told the story. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. The gallery stayed packed, people refusing to leave. Some prayed, others held hands. Margaret sat quietly, her daughter's arm draped protectively over her shoulders. Finally, the bailiff returned. The room rose. The foreperson's voice trembled slightly as the verdict was read. On the charge of aggravated assault against a disabled person, guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority under color of law, guilty. On the charge of disorderly conduct, guilty. Gasps filled the courtroom. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Aaliyah squeezed her shoulder, tears pooling in her eyes. Granger slumped forward in his seat, his attorney's hand on his back. The once confident officer now looked like a broken man. The judge set sentencing for the following month. But in many ways, the verdict was the true sentence. As the gavel struck, the gallery erupted in cheers, tears, applause. Reporters rushed out to file breaking news alerts. But in the middle of the noise sat Margaret and Aaliyah, holding hands, their eyes locked, the bond between them stronger than ever. Margaret whispered softly to her daughter, "You didn't just defend me, you defended every mother." And Aaliyah, choking back tears, replied, "No, Mama, you defended us all with your strength. Justice had been served, but the story doesn't end here." The Stones' fight became a spark, a reminder what accountability should look like. What do you think? Was justice truly done in this case? Or is this just one victory in a much larger battle? Let us know in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you believe these stories need to be told, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us every week as we uncover the truths that others try to hide. Because sometimes the most powerful battles aren't fought on the streets. They're won in the courtroom.